Hello, I am Mikhail Velichko. I was asked to start a cycle of lectures on the sufficiently general theory of governance on the channel Sphera. Here, basic literature. The sufficiently general theory of governance, preliminary materials of the training course of the Faculty of Applied Mathematics and Processes of Governance of St. Petersburg State University. First of all, I want to make it clear that this course is not an alternative to reading this book and other materials in which the sufficiently general theory of governance is laid out. Why is it not an alternative? Simply because all people are different, and some perceive information better by ear, others better perceive information from the text. Therefore, for those who understand better by ear, the text should help later, in their free time, to understand, clarify those questions that they did not understand from the lectures or simply forgot parts of the lectures. For those who better perceive through the text, by strength of the peculiarities of the text and personal perception, not everything can be understood either, and in such cases, oral explanations can open access to that which was not immediately understood. In addition, the cycle assumes the opportunity to ask questions, which I will answer after the list of questions has been formed. We will look at it, evaluate the significance of each of the questions, and then the lectures will be built in this way. First, the answers to the questions asked in the previous lecture. After this, the lecture itself, and recommendations on what to read in the future, so that the next lecture does not fall into emptiness, but is perceived on some previously prepared ground. I want to clarify that this is not some kind of whim of mine, but really practice shows that if students read something on their own before a lecture, then the lecture is perceived better, and knowledge is obtained deeper and more firmly. Well, the reasons are simple. Any knowledge we carry, any skill we carry, is a product of our own labor. People in our environment can know much more than us. They can know much more than we do, but they are not able to retranslate their knowledge and skills in a ready-to-use form to us. Everything that we want to know and be able to do, we must work out on our own. This also applies to the sufficiently general theory of governance. First of all, I want to clarify the title. Why the sufficiently general theory of governance? The word sufficiently expresses the subjective opinions of the authors. From their point of view, this theory of governance is indeed sufficiently general. If someone in his practical activity is faced with the fact that it is not sufficient to solve his problems, then he is given the opportunity to generate a more general theory of governance than presented by the authors of the version that lies at the basis of the conception of social safety in the version of the internal predictor of the USSR. It is general because, from our point of view, the conceptual apparatus of the sufficiently general theory of governance allows us to interpret any technical process, any natural process, any social process, any process in the psyche of an individual or the collective psyche of society as a process of governance or self-governance that occurs in interaction with other processes, both equal in rank to them, and encompassing processes in the entire set of processes in the universe. The question may arise, why is this needed? We live in such a time that no one is able to accommodate in their psyche all the achievements of culture that are in the life of human civilization. Not even able to accommodate the good and useful that is there, not to mention the fact that in culture, if we consider it as an informational algorithmic system, there is a lot of all sorts of nonsense. In addition, we live on the basis of collective labor. Collective labor is based on the professional specialization of people, and in complex projects, narrow specialists who thoroughly know their sector must interact with each other. If they cannot effectively interact with each other because they do not find a common language, then complex projects either fall apart or their implementation leads to unpredictable side effects, many of which are simply harmful and pose a threat to life and to the users of these projects. And if these are large-scale projects, then side effects pose a threat to the life of the entire global civilization. Therefore, the modern era and future prospects simply require that there would appear a certain common supra-professional language which would allow participants in complex projects to mutually understand each other and coordinate their activities in such a way that the knowledge and skills of some successfully supplement the knowledge and skills of others without generating destructive and dangerous side effects. That is why the sufficiently general theory of governance, which allows the possibility of describing any process as a process of governance, can become the language of a supra-professional, narrowly specialized level, where narrow specialists can coordinate their activities and achieve useful effects without generating harmful side effects. The question may arise, how do different theories of governance differ? Well, first of all, there are narrowly specialized theories of governance towards aircraft, theories of governance towards certain technical systems. They are characterized by narrow specialization and the impossibility of applying each of them in other spheres. That is why the question arises as to whether there should be some kind of theory of governance that would make it possible to formulate and solve different tasks of governance in different spheres of human activity and civilization as a whole. Different governorial tasks have their own specifics, and if the theory of governance cannot be detached from the specifics, it is tied to it, then, on its basis, it is impossible to solve governorial tasks in other spheres. But if there are different theories of governance, then each of them offers its users its own structure for formulating and solving governorial tasks. And precisely because of the peculiarities of the structures that each of them offers, some theories can solve some tasks. Other theories cannot solve tasks that do not fit into their structure. Therefore, the question arises about the structure of the formulation and solution of governorial tasks, which would cover the specifics of any sector, and so that the specifics of the formulation and solution of governorial tasks in each of them fit into the structure of the sufficiently general theory of governance, universal in the sense of the possibility of its application. If you don't have such a theory, but your potential opponents and competitors have it, then this will inevitably lead to the fact that life will offer some kind of problem that you cannot solve on the basis of your theory of governance. And your opponent, who uses a more perfect theory of governance, he will guaranteedly solve it. You yourselves understand that in this case you will suffer some damage, and if the opponent is malicious enough, then this damage can be expressed in the fact that you simply cease to exist, both as a physical and as a legal entity. Well, if these are some kind of global processes, processes of global politics, then you will cease to exist as a people, as a peculiar civilization. Therefore, the question of mastering the sufficiently general theory of governance, in the sense of universality of its application, is one of the most relevant issues in the life of any society. Because if we look into the historical past, if we look into the present, then each society differs in how it is governed, the specifics of governance. Since the specifics of governance is such that some societies are governed more effectively, others are governed less effectively, the quality of life of each of these societies, the quality of life of individuals in these societies also differ, and the spectrum of these differences is very wide, because some societies are on the verge of self-destruction. Other societies, standing on the verge of self-destruction, have the potential for development and carry the means to realize this potential, while still other societies, standing on the verge of self-destruction, having the ability to egress from this situation, do not have the means that allow them to egress. If we turn to our historical past, the catastrophe of 1917 is a catastrophe of governance. The governance offered by the imperial elite did not allow solving those tasks, responding to the challenges of the time that the empire faced. If we talk about modern times, then the protracted economic crisis in which the country has lived after 1985 to the present is also a crisis of inadequate governance. And in order to egress from this crisis, we must enter into the mode of universal governorial literacy. There is nothing new, because if you read, say, Henry Ford, his book, My Life and Work, Ford believed that the main task of the governorial personnel of the Ford Motor Company is to awaken governorial skills in all employees of the company, because Ford anticipated that the result would be an increase in the quality of governance within the Ford Motor Company, an improvement in its competitive ability, and, as a result, the quality of life of American society would increase. In this respect, Ford was certainly right. This is the prehistory of the question and the prerequisites for really getting into the study of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Well, the first question is, how did it come into existence? Let us begin with the fact that there was such a work, dehermetization. Certain provisions of the sufficiently general theory of governance are expressed in dehermetization in connection with the consideration of these or those questions of history. In other words, the sufficiently general theory of governance, in the form in which it was presented in Dead Water, as is presented in the preliminary materials of the training course, the sufficiently general theory of governance, did not arise out of nowhere. From where did it come into dehermetization? It entered into dehermetization from our practice. In 1979, the publishing house Shipbuilding published the book Governance Towards Marine Mobile Objects. In this book, a certain version of the theory of governance in relation to the tasks of governance towards marine mobile objects was presented. In general, this is the starting version of the theory of governance, which underwent an upgrade, resulting in the sufficiently general theory of governance. How is the sufficiently general theory of governance different from everything else? There are several such differences. First, the sufficiently general theory of governance introduces the concept, the entire function of governance. The concept, the entire function of governance, implies that governance can be carried out according to the entire function, or can be carried out not according to the entire function. The entire function of governance is a sequence of stages of multi-qualitative actions which make up the process of governance in its entirety. If you ask students the question of how they understand, what does governance begin with, then in most cases they say that governance begins with the organization of structures and the distribution of functional responsibilities in these structures. Who should do what? Who has the right to give what orders? Who should monitor the implementation of these orders? Well, most people have such ideas. Few people are able to respond in such a way that governance begins with the setting of objectives and planning to achieve objectives. But this is also the wrong answer, because in order for you to engage in setting of objectives, there must be some external stimulus for this, or some kind of inner understanding of something that would encourage you to organize the process of governance. Therefore, the beginning of the entire function of governance is not given at all by the setting of objectives and not by the organization of any structures. The beginning of the entire function of governance reveals the factor of the environment that puts pressure on your psyche and creates discomfort. The discomfort can be different. You really are faced with a factor that prevents you from living comfortably the way you would like to live. But the discomfort can be of a different kind. There is no factor that affects you and creates some kind of trouble, but there is a possibility that this factor will arise in the future and really create trouble for you. And you are faced with the need to prevent the occurrence of such a factor. And for this, you must close the possibilities. Therefore, the fact that in the most general sense, the word factor is that which causes discomfort and compels a person to take up problematics of governance. This is already concretics in life. The beginning of the entire function of governance is always given by a factor of the environment that causes discomfort, and thus brings forward the need to organize governance. Once this factor has been detected, it must be distinguished from the rest of the event background. To put it differently, you must build a certain set of characteristic features that allows any person to detect this factor in the environment according to a certain set of features, if it is present, and to be at ease if this factor is not present. The next step of the entire function is setting of objectives in relation to this factor. What do you want? Well, there are two main variants. To egress from its action, and the second variant is to exert your own impact on the environment in such a way that this factor ceases to exert on you a negative impact, which you perceive as discomfort. After you have decided what you want, the question arises, how to achieve the objectives? How to achieve objectives is a question, and the answer to it is given by the conception of governance, i.e., that sequence of actions as a result of which the objective should become a reality. The presence of the conception of governance leads to another concept, the concept of stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of its behavior to a certain measure under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance itself. The term is long. In short, it is stability in terms of predictability. This term stems from the fact that if you are not able to predict the development of the situation with sufficient for you accuracy, then you cannot organize governance in principle. If you can predict the development of the situation, then, in principle, you can enter into it as a governor and lead the situation to those objectives that you set for yourself. So, the concept of stability of objects in terms of predictability of behavior, this is a broader concept than the concept of stability in the form in which it's accepted in most types of technology and in the form in which most people understand it in everyday life. Because if something is unstable in the usual sense of the term stability, but you can predict its behavior. You can, in principle, organize the process of governance towards this unstable object, and the process of governance will be stable enough for you to achieve your objectives. It is this circumstance that makes the concept of stability in terms of predictability of behavior a broader concept of stability than the generally accepted concepts of stability in mathematics, theoretical mechanics, electrical engineering, electronics, and other processes. Where does this lead? We very often come across recipes for solving tasks, including gubernatorial tasks. But when we try to apply these recipes to the solution of our tasks, we don't always think about the conditions under which these recipes were obtained and proved to be functionally operable. Now, if we have an idea of the stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability, then we can ask ourselves whether the recipe for solving the task corresponds to the conditions in which we find ourselves and in which we are trying to solve this task. And we can get an answer that the recipe does not correspond to these conditions. If we receive such an answer, then we must work out some other recipe for solving the task, or admit our inconsistency as a governor in relation to this task. And in this case, we refrain from solving this task. But if we cannot evaluate these conditions based on the concept of the stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior, then we can apply the recipe in situations in which it's obviously not functionally operable. This functional inoperability of it can be expressed in different ways. That is, we will get the result not as high quality as we want, or it can be expressed in the fact that we will not get the expected result, but we will get some kind of catastrophe which for us may turn out to be deadly, and not only for us, but also for those around us. Therefore, the concept of stability in terms of predictability, it is very important. Because if it exists, and you can solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of the object, then you can build the conception of governance towards the object yourself. And if you evaluate some recipe, then you can clearly distinguish between those areas where this recipe for solving tasks is applicable and those areas in which this recipe for solving tasks is either not applicable in principle or is applicable with less quality than you would like. So, the concept of stability in terms of predictability, this is the specifics of the sufficiently general theory of governance. In other theories of governance, this concept is either completely absent, or the task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior is solved in some implicit, indirect form. But, one way or the other, it must be solved in order for the conception of governance to arise. And only after the conception of governance has taken shape, formed, does the stage of implementation of the conception into life begin. And at this stage, structures may arise that carry the algorithmics expressing the conception of governance. Therefore, when people say that governance begins with the organization of structures, they are deeply mistaken, because the organization of structures is preceded by several more stages of the entire function of governance. In addition, the construction of structures before the beginning of the process of governance is not at all necessary for the processes of governance to flow. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, there is a concept of methods of governance. There are three such methods of governance. Structural method of governance, when a specially constructed structure is the carrier of the algorithmics of governance. The quality of governance is determined by the architecture of the structure, that is, a set of functionally specialized elements from which it is built, and the interconnections of these elements with each other, and the character of their interaction with each other and with the external environment. Errors in the construction of the structure lead to a drop in the quality of governance. But situations are possible in which there is governance, but there are no structures in the sense that everyone understands them. Well, for example, here is a task of governance: collecting money for travel in transport. There are two variants. Either the conductor or the driver, who also performs the duties of a conductor, collects money. Well, let's say it's a conductor. What are the responsibilities? Collect money from passengers, give change to passengers, give tickets. If passengers have questions about where to get off, how to get somewhere, then the conductor, in most cases, knows the route and what's adjacent to the route, and gives corresponding advice to passengers. Well, now recall Soviet times. On a bus without a conductor, there was a ticket box. Passengers got on, dropped money in, and tore off a ticket. If someone needed change, then another passenger, instead of dropping money into the ticket box, gave the money to the passenger who needed change. If someone had questions about where to get off, how to get somewhere, then in the majority of cases, passengers traveling along this route also knew the route and what was near the route. With a high probability, there was a passenger on the bus who could answer these questions. So there was no conductor, the personal composition of the passengers on the bus was changing, but nonetheless, the task of governance was solved in a statistically predetermined sense. The question arises, is the quality of governance, with the presence of a conductor, higher or lower than in the situation where there are ticket boxes on the bus? The answer is also twofold. Because the concept of quality of governance is subjectively conditioned, and the question arises, what, in fact, do you want? If you want a conductor, then you have to pay him a salary. If there is no conductor, then you save on the salary of the conductor, but there will be an additional number of bus hoppers, and you must increase the staff of inspectors accordingly. And if the cost of additional inspectors is less than the cost of maintaining the staff of conductors, then you get some gain. And you can assume that the quality of governance on the bus without a conductor is higher than with a conductor. But there is the next level of consideration. For the system to work, you must produce tickets. In order to produce tickets, it's necessary to prepare timber, produce paper, print tickets. For printing, appropriate paints are needed. You must deliver the tickets to the transport service. The transport service must somehow store them somewhere. Well, after the passenger buys a ticket, he gets off the bus and, in the best case, he drops it into the trash can. And in the worst case, he just drops it on the ground. And, in fact, it turns out that you produce tickets in order that they be dropped on the ground, and then the cleaning of the city be engaged in. That is, at a certain level, the production of tickets can be considered simply worthless costs that lower the quality of the functioning of the economy. And, at a certain level, perhaps the answer to the question is that neither conductors nor tickets are needed, and transport should be on the state budget, and in general for society it is lower cost than tickets and a conductor. But this already requires a reorganization of the entire macroeconomic system, because if the system is what it is now, then such a variant is impossible. But this example is an example of what can be called a structureless method of governance. In a structureless method of governance, structures are not purpose-orientedly created. They arise by themselves in a probabilistically predetermined way, on the basis of the information that the elements of a certain plurality, every one of them, carry in their memory. If there is a plurality of elements, every one of which has several characteristic features, some information and algorithmics in its memory, on the basis of which its self-governance is built, it can perceive information from the external environment, and it can give out information into the external environment. And if there is a plurality of elements, every one of which has these three features, the autonomy of memory, the ability to self-govern based on the memory, and the ability to give out and receive information from the external environment, then such a plurality can be called a supersystem. And in a supersystem, structureless governance is possible, which is based on the distribution of information in society, addressed information, which is actually addressed to some subpluralities of elements in this plurality, or addressless information that is distributed simply in the who can accept it mode. Well, and those good fellows who could not accept it, that is their business. But the dissemination of information can predictably lead to the emergence of structures that can work and solve post-governorial tasks. This is a structureless method of governance. But if you only have an idea of a structural method of governance, and do not have an idea about a structureless method of governance, then you will perceive as ungoverned and random processes those processes that are really governed processes. Structureless governance allows organizing stock exchange panic. Structureless governance allows governing electoral campaigns. And structureless governance allows a lot more if one knows how to use it. So, the plurality of such elements that have the ability to self-govern based on memory information, interacting with other elements on the basis of relaying information to them and receiving information from them, interacting with the external environment, can be called a supersystem, as it is done in the sufficiently general theory of governance. In supersystems, governance is possible both through a structural and a structureless method. But, in addition, supersystems can be nested in each other on the principle of the Russian nesting doll. That is, one supersystem is a subplurality in another supersystem. And, accordingly, the elements of the first supersystem are, at the same time, the elements of the second supersystem, which encompasses it. But not all elements of the encompassing supersystem are elements of the first, nested supersystem. In such cases, situations are possible when governance, based on the structural method, penetrates from the encompassing supersystem into the nested supersystem. In other words, a certain number of elements of the nested supersystem are elements of the structure built in the encompassing supersystem. And the interrelationship between supersystems can be such that the encompassing supersystem is not visible from the position of the nested supersystem. What will happen then? Then, if you look at the situation from the standpoint of a nested supersystem, you will see that at some moments in time, some elements of the nested supersystem begin to act in a coordinated manner for no reason and without any interconnection with each other, as a result of which certain objectives of governance are achieved. This is governance on the basis of virtual structures. Why virtual? Because from the point of view of a nested supersystem, the structures do not exist. They are not present. But from the point of view of the encompassing supersystem, the structures exist. They are present. And they are activated by certain processes from the encompassing supersystem. In this case, a dynamic redistribution of the functional load between the elements of the structure can also occur. Therefore, from the point of view of one supersystem, there is no structure, but from the point of view of the other supersystem, the structure acts, and it is active. Governance on the basis of the action of virtual structures differs from governance on the basis of a structureless method, and from governance on the basis of a structural method localized within one and the same supersystem. Examples of governance on the basis of virtual structures: a network of sleeper agents of the enemy special services. All of them look like ordinary citizens of one state, but the moment X arrives, and they begin to manifest activity in the interests of another state. Many mystical phenomena in the life of society. They are also expressed in governance on the basis of virtual structures, but carried out from hierarchically higher in relation to society levels in the organization of creation. Such levels are the noosphere of the planet, which, from the point of view of many, does not exist because it cannot be seen with one's own eyes, cannot be touched by hands. The almightiness of God, which for many is an object of faith or an object of non-faith. Nevertheless, for the entirety of the picture and entirety of possibilities, one must understand that governance is possible through these three methods. The structural method of governance, when the structure is built in advance in relation to the beginning of the process of governance. Structureless governance, when structures take shape statistically or in a probabilistically predetermined way, based on the information that is in the elements of the supersystem, under the impact of the information that impacts the elements of the supersystem, and governance on the basis of virtual structures. When the de facto structures exist, they have taken shape in a certain way, and then, at the right time, they are activated in one way or the other. If you have no idea about the structureless method of governance and governance on the basis of virtual structures, then much of what is governed, in fact, will appear to you as not governed. And you will be hostages in the situation in which structureless governance, or governance on the basis of virtual structures, is carried out. In addition, the sufficiently general theory of governance introduces the concept of schemes of governance that are realized in the process of governance. These schemes of governance realize conceptions of governance in one way or the other. Program scheme of governance. The program scheme of governance does not react to changes in the external environment with which the system of governance interacts. There are no feedback lines, there are only feed-forward lines through which commands follow. The commands are sent in accordance with the internal timer, which is in the system of governance. The program method of governance allows you to achieve the objectives in cases where the circumstances of the application of the program correspond to the program. The second method is the program adaptive method of governance. There are feed-forward lines through which the governorial commands go, and there are feedback lines through which there flow information streams about the state of the environment, the state of the object of governance, and the state of the system of governance. The program adaptive scheme implements the program without changing it, but adapts to the concretics of those circumstances in which the program or conception of governance is implemented. The program adaptive scheme is characterized by the fact that it reacts to the changes that have taken place. But it may turn out that the changes that have taken place are such that the quality of governance, the power of the system of governance, the resources available to it, do not allow you to provide the quality of governance that you would like. What can be done in such cases? Well, in such cases, you can transition to proactive governance. That is, you do not wait until something begins to exert an impact on you and the process of governance, and this impact in its power will be such that the system simply does not have the potential to adequately react to it. If you can react proactively to changes in the environment, to the impact of the environment on the object, or to the process of governance, then, in this case, you can organize governance in such a way that the impact of the external environment does not gain such power that the system cannot react to it with an acceptable for you quality of governance. But in order to organize proactive governance, you must conduct prognostics at the pace of the flow of the process of governance, and you must correct the governing impact based not only on what has already happened, but also on the basis of the prognosis of the development of the situation. In other words, in this scheme of governance, which is called a predictor-corrector, the task of the stability of the object in terms of predictability is solved not only before the start of governance and building a system of governance towards the object, but also at the pace of interaction of the object with the external environment. This allows improving the quality of governance, but requires a different organization of the process of governance. The highest variant of the implementation of the predictor-corrector scheme is an intellectual scheme of governance, in which artificial or human individual or collective intellect solves the task of stability in terms of predictability, of changing the conception of governance at the pace of the development of the situation. These are the main features that characterize the sufficiently general theory of governance. Now let us return, understanding this, to the concept of the entire function of governance. The beginning of the entire function of governance, as I said, is given by a factor of the environment that puts pressure on the psyche, causes discomfort, and thus requires the organization of governance. This is followed by the stage of describing this factor of the environment in order that it would be recognizable not only by those who encounter it for the first time, but also for other people. Next comes the setting of objectives in relation to this factor. Setting of objectives is followed by the development of a conception of governance based on solving the task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior of the object of governance under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance itself. After the working out of the conception, the following stage goes: the implementation of the conception of governance in life, that is, building the necessary structures and creating information that allows you to organize governance on the basis of a structureless method or on the basis of virtual structures of governance. Next comes the stage of implementation of the conception. The stage of implementation of the conception of governance presupposes monitoring over the flow of processes and, if necessary, correction of the conception of governance, correction of setting of objectives, correction of the architecture of structures, correction of the algorithmics on the basis of which a structural and structureless method of governance, governance on the basis of virtual structures, is built. The process of governance completes either with the achievement of the intended objectives and the freeing of resources previously occupied in the process of governance for the solution of other tasks, or you don't achieve the objectives at all, or with the acceptable quality. And this circumstance forces you, if circumstances allow, to return to the first stage and go through the entire function of governance again in order to achieve a higher quality of governance in the next approximation of the solution of the task set by you, if it is still relevant for you. If you have understood what the entire function of governance is, then, from this concept, you are able to develop any theory of governance, be it a sufficiently general one, be it even some applied one, with the degree of detailedness you need. If you have no idea about the entire function of governance, then you are doomed to find yourself in situations where some stages of the entire function of governance will be controlled by others, and you will be their hostage. Because the situation is such that each previous stage, it conditions the possibilities of opening and closing in subsequent stages. And so it turns out that those who hold the first stages of the entire function of governance, they actually reign over those who hold the subsequent stages and have no idea about the entire function of governance, in order to egress from the power of the first, if this power is not beneficial for them. These are the basic principles that distinguish the sufficiently general theory of governance from all other theories of governance, because in cybernetics, in other versions of theories of governance, management, in fact, there is no concept of the entire function. There is no concept of the stability of an object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior. There is no concept of a structureless method of governance, and governance on the basis of virtual structures. Further arise questions about the specifics of structuring information related to the task of governance. How is information structured in its most general form? Well, the first thing is to distinguish between the object of governance and the environment. What relates to the object? This is the object. What relates to the environment? This is the environment. The environment and the object are connected by certain processes of interaction. Governance presupposes a system of governance. The system of governance is connected with the object of governance by the contours of feed-forward and feedback lines. Feed-forward lines are those lines through which the governing impact is transmitted into the object of governance. Feedback lines are those lines through which the system of governance receives information about the state of the object. This is classics. The sufficiently general theory of governance assumes an expanded understanding of feed-forward and feedback lines. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, feed-forward lines go not only into the object, but also into the environment with which the object interacts. And feedback lines go into the system of governance not only from the object of governance, but also from the environment with which the object interacts. Nevertheless, both in the classics and in the sufficiently general theory of governance, the system of governance, connected with the object by the contours of feed-forward and feedback lines, is called an enclosed system. This is the term. The difference between the classics and the sufficiently general theory of governance is that feed-forward and feedback lines, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, are interpreted in an extended manner. Some of the feed-forward lines go into the environment. Some of the feedback lines come into the system of governance from the environment. What is it caused by? This is caused by the fact that the sufficiently general theory of governance presupposes consideration of the hierarchy of internestedness of processes of governance, one in the other. In addition, it presupposes consideration of such situations where one and the same object of governance, or one and the same enclosed system, is supposed to be governed, or is actually governed, by different subjects. To put it differently, if you have an enclosed system, in it there is a system of governance, then yes, indeed, some feedback lines go into it, only from the object of governance. But some of the feedback lines go into the system of governance from the environment. And if in the environment there is another subject, another system of governance, with claims to govern one and the same object, then the feedback lines of the first system of governance become feed-forward lines for the second subject, which exerts an impact on the first system of governance, and the feedback lines of this second subject, they also include feed-forward lines of the first system of governance. Therefore, there happens such an inversion of feed-forward and feedback lines. In the case of conflicts of governance, this is very important, because the question arises as to whose governance is effective. But what from the point of view of one subject is its feed-forward lines? From the point of view of another, in this case, is its feedback lines, and vice versa. What from the point of view of the first subject is its feedback lines? From the point of view of the second subject is its feed-forward lines. Therefore, proceeding from the fact that such situations in life are encountered quite often, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, an expanded interpretation of the term feed-forward and feedback lines is adopted. Further, in the classics, there is also such a concept as positive feedback lines and negative feedback lines. In the classics, they are divided into positive and negative on the basis that if the object is in some kind of stable mode, and then deviates from the stable mode of functioning, then information passes through the chains of positive feedback lines, which takes the object even further from the stable mode, and the deviation increases. And information, which entails the return of the object to the previously stable mode, passes through negative feedback lines. But again, if we consider situations when an object can be governed by different subjects, and different subjects have a different hierarchical status, then it turns out that if there is a first subject and an object of governance, they form an enclosed system. This system in some way self-governs, and there is a second subject, which is hierarchically higher in relation to the first subject, and it also governs in a certain way the first object and the subject. Then the situation is such that if the first subject governs the process in a way which is acceptable for the second subject, then the second subject does not need to intervene. If the first subject takes the object out of the limits of the admissible, then the second subject must somehow react to this. And, accordingly, negative feedback lines contain information that restrains the process of a deviation of the object of governance from the mode prescribed by the hierarchically higher subject of governance. But if the deviation is of a character that is recognized as useful by the hierarchically higher subject of governance, then information flows through the chains of the feedback lines, which contributes to the deviation of the object of governance from the initial mode and further. In other words, in the first case, the hierarchically higher subject exerts a restraining, suppressive impact on the process of deviation from the initial mode, and in the second case, it exerts an encouraging, supportive impact. Therefore, feedback lines in the sufficiently general theory of governance are divided into two classes. What in the classics is called negative feedback lines are called restraining feedback lines, suppressive feedback lines. These are synonyms. And positive feedback lines are called encouraging feedback lines, supportive feedback lines. This, in fact, is the main thing with regard to the sufficiently general theory of governance. What else remains? There remains the question of how to organize information related to the process of governance. Well, the information can be divided into three modules. The first module, the vector of objectives of governance, contains all objectives of governance. The vector of objectives of governance forms a hierarchy of objectives, ordered in the reverse order of the sequence of forced abandonment of each of the objectives. That is, the most important objective is in the first place. In the last place is the objective that can be abandoned first, in the conditions that the entire set of objectives cannot be realized. The vector of objectives of governance characterizes the ideal that should be achieved as a result of governance. Reality differs from ideal. And reality is described by the vector of current state. The hierarchy of the vector of current state repeats the hierarchy of parameters in the vector of objectives of governance. But if we could directly exert an impact on any object, then we would not need to go to the trouble of creating the sufficiently general theory of governance and its applications. In the majority of cases, we cannot directly impact what is included in the vector of objectives of governance. And it is precisely from this circumstance that the need for the sufficiently general theory of governance and the need for the skills of applying it to solving practical tasks in life arise. Therefore, the vector of current state has a dimensionality greater than the vector of objectives. The increase in the dimensionality of the vector of state occurs on account of the inclusion in it of additional parameters, which, in life, are connected with the parameters that repeat the structure of the vector of objectives by the objective laws of being, These additional parameters, which are included in the vector of current state, can be divided into two groups. The first group are those parameters that we can impact directly, and the change of which entails a predictable for us change in the parameters, which repeat the set of parameters of the vector of objectives. These parameters that we can directly impact, and the change of which entails desirable for us changes in the parameters included in the vector of objectives, they form a vector of governing impact. It is part of the vector of current state. In addition, free parameters are included in the vector of current state. Free parameters are characterized by the fact that any of their values in the process of governance are recognized as acceptable. They can also change during the process of governance. But since they are not included in the vector of objectives of governance, they are, in most cases, not of interest to us. But in some cases, processes of governance can be such that some free parameters can go into the parameters of the vector of objectives of governance. Well, what are the cases? For example, the flight altitude of an airplane can, in some conditions, be a free parameter. But if you have to fly over a mountain range, then you must take care that the flight altitude is not lower than the top of this mountain range. And accordingly, the previously free parameter ceases to be free and is included in the vector of objectives of governance. Further, after the vector of current state is formed, and you have a pair of vectors, the vector of objectives of governance, the vector of current state, you can build their difference. Difference, in the broadest sense of the term difference, is just a difference. If the vector of objectives, in the most general sense, can be described as a list, I want, ordered by significance, then the vector of current state is described in terms reality as such, reality as such, reality as such. Well, and the vector of error of governance, being the difference between the vector of objectives of governance and the vector of current state, is described in terms of dissatisfaction. Dissatisfied with this, dissatisfied with this, dissatisfied with this. But you see, if we consider situations when different subjects intend or claim to govern one and the same object of governance, then a situation may arise when the vector of objectives of one is perceived by the other as an error of governance. And what is perceived by the first as an error of governance is, in fact, the vector of objectives for the other. And therefore, what, from the point of view of the first, is a catastrophe of governance, from the point of view of the second, is the achievement of the set by him objectives of governance. In other words, this formula, the vector of objectives minus the vector of state, is equal to the vector of error. This formula, like any algebraic formula, allows the transfer of elements from the right side of the equality to the left side of the equality, and vice versa. Therefore, when we talk about processes of governance, we must always bear this in mind. And understand who works for what objectives, who declares work for what objectives, but works, in fact, for other objectives. And this will simplify a lot in life. I have described the basic terms, basic concepts, their interconnections. Further, one should only understand that this formula, the vector of objectives minus the vector of current state, is equal to the vector of error of governance. It structures information at all stages of the implementation of the conception of governance. And the task of governance is either to nullify the vector of error, or, the same thing, to achieve the vector of objectives. That is, the vector of state must be identically equal to the vector of objectives of governance in the part that coincides in dimensionality with the vector of objectives of governance. Well, everything I said was abstractionism, and further on, everything is concretics. This is a general, introductory lecture on the theory of governance, the sufficiently general theory of governance, which gives an idea of it as a whole. Subsequent lectures will be devoted to various questions related to what the entire function of governance is, how it is built in processes of governance, how it's implemented in processes of governance, and all the terms and concepts that I named in this lecture we will consider in detail in subsequent lectures. I repeat once again that if someone has any questions, you write. In 2 weeks, we will analyze the questions, draw up a certain list, and I will begin the next lecture by explaining the questions that have arisen, and then there will be a theme of the lecture itself. I say again that lectures are only an aid in order to understand what is written in the books, and your task is to read the thick books. Currently, the sufficiently general theory of governance is presented on the internet, well, at least 3 editions. The first is a complete version in the preliminary materials of the training course, The Sufficiently General Theory of Governance, and in dead water. The second edition, abridged, is in the first volume of Fundamentals of Sociology. In addition, there is the first edition of 1991, which is also presented on the internet according to the text of Dead Water of the 1992 edition. And besides, there are also processed audio tapes of several of my lectures on the sufficiently general theory of governance. I have read them too. They should be posted on the channel Sphera in the near future. In general, these texts are mutually supplementary. The lectures are intended primarily for those who understand better by ear. Well, it can also be useful to those who perceive information from the text well, and reading the text causes some bewilderment and needs for explanations. If you have any specific questions, please write. We will consider the questions, and those that correspond to the course, go beyond it, we will answer them. Thank you for your attention. That's all for today. All the best to you.